Okay, in today's lesson we are going to be looking at inheritance and variation. So, the first thing I'd like to do, I'd like to look at these dogs. I'd like to choose 5 different characteristics. They can be the same for all the dogs, they can be different for different dogs. And I'd like to write down 5 characteristics. For example, height, number of legs, you name it. 5 different characteristics. Okay, so we're hopefully going to be able to define the word variation and inherited at the end of this lesson. Hopefully we're going to be able to decide whether or not characteristics are inherited. And then we're hopefully going to look at the ideas of continuous and discontinuous data. So the first thing I'd like you to do is I'd like you to have a think about some inherited concepts and some environmental things that you might pick up from your environment. So, for example, an inherited concept might be eye colour. Your environment doesn't tend to change your eye colour. We tend to be born with one colour eyes, and there might be a slight fluctuation right near the beginning of when we are alive, but mostly that eye colour will stay with us throughout the rest of our lives. Some other inherited ones might be some particular diseases, for example, autism or Down syndrome or something like Tay-Sachs disease. These are inherited. We get them from our parents. On a slightly lighter note, we might look at inheriting the ability to roll our tongues, or some people are double jointed. If we converse that against environmental factors, we might look at things like scarring. Obviously, if you get a scar, that's something that you aren't born with. That's something that you develop as a result of something that happens in your life, some environmental input that we end up dealing with. That's quite common for us to think about factors like weight and height as environmental. Both of those things have obviously a large environmental impact. A lot of you, I'm sure, could tell me that eating lots of burgers is going to mean that you put on much more weight. Similarly, most people would consider themselves to be of a certain skin colour because they were born with that skin colour, and that is true. However, all 3 of those things also have inherited concepts. So all 3 of these things, weight, height and skin colour, have both an inherited aspect, but also have environmental inputs. For example, your weight and your height are partially to do with what genes you get from your parents. You might get tall genes, or particular body shape from your parents, or skin colour from your parents. But similarly, you might also have a large diet, which is an environmental concept. You might also have encountered a disease when you were particularly young that's affected your growth. And obviously, skin colour changes with exposure to sunlight, which is why all people tan to various different degrees. Some people are more likely to burn, some people are more likely to tan, but regardless of your skin colour, exposure to the sun, that environmental impact will potentially change how you look. You'll find most things on the environmental list have some element, different elements, but some element of inheritance. So very quickly, I'd like you to have a look at this, see if you can fill this out. Inherited characteristics, where do they come from? Well, they come from our parents. Our environmental characteristics, where do they come from? Well, obviously they come from the environment. That might be our diet, that might be what we're exposed to, that might be chemicals we come into contact with. See if you can give an example. Okay, so a little mini quiz for you just to see how on the ball you are. You can write the answers down, but you don't have to. When characteristics come from our parents, we call them adaptations, variations, or inherited. And yes, you're right. Of course, the answer is inherited. We call the difference between the dogs adaptation, variation, or inherited. What do you think? Yep, they are variations. That's the differences between those dogs. They are variations. Okay, so have a look at this family tree here. You'll see that both um, Molly and Arthur have had three children: Bill, George, and Ron. Obviously, we're just dealing with the men in the family here. And each of these men have married three different women and had children with them. So, whose children are most likely to have black hair? Obviously, Angelina is the only one of these three men. Oh, sorry, of these three women here that has black hair, and so it's most likely that hers and George's children will have black hair. Who's the most likely to have blonde children? Well, by the same extension, the only blonde shown here is Fleur. So Bill and Fleur's children are the most likely to be blonde. So we've talked about the fact that your unique characteristics are caused by the unique set of genes you have inherited from your parents, the environment in which you have developed, and there are differences in some characteristics due to a combination of both inherited factors and environmental factors. So we tend to talk about variation in two types. There is continuous variation, which is the idea that a feature can be measured and given a value from a range of values. And there is discontinuous, which we used to call categoric variation, where your data might fit into distinct categories. To give you some examples, continuous variation might be foot length, because your foot could be 30 centimetres, it could be 31 centimetres, it could be 31.2 centimetres. It is on a continuous scale. However, shoe size would more likely be categoric, because your shoe size can only be a size 4 or a size 4.5 or a size 5. There is no idea that is a shoe size 5.13. So your shoe size fits into distinct discontinuous categories. Let's look at some other examples. This is an example of continuous variation. Shown here we have a people's mass measured in kgs and the rough number of players that are in each of those categories. Really, these are often shown on a scatter graph, but sometimes sometimes people like to show them on a bar chart because people seem to understand a bar chart more. But importantly, that this graph does show us is a trending line of best fit, curving up there around about the 100 kg mark. And continuous variation is almost always due to that combined effect of both genes and the environment. Discontinuous variation, however, this idea of having distinct categories, Okay, you've only got a few very different options. Either you have this characteristic or you have this one. You can't be in the middle. Examples include blood group, eye colour, inherited diseases. And almost always discontinuous variation is the result of genes only. And we always show these in bar charts. So here on the right hand side we've got a blood group discontinuous bar chart where 7 people have blood type O, 6 have blood type A, and then 1 person is in category B and category AB for blood type. So I'd like you to sketch a couple of graphs in your books. Use a ruler to do the axes. Okay, but I'm not anticipating you to count up numbers of lines or try and work out exactly how far up the lines should be. It should be rough, it should be a sketch. Okay, I'm not looking for exact concrete numbers. Imagine you were looking at your science class. You're going to have to estimate because I don't imagine that you can remember every single person in your science class and work out what eye colour they have. I'd like you just to come up with what you imagine that they would be. For eye colour, I'd just like you to focus on 4 categories: black, blue, brown and green eyes. And for height, I'd like you to use centimetres. For reference, the shortest year 8s are about 110, 120 centimetres, and the tallest are maybe 180, 190 centimetres. So this is the point I'm going to want you to pause the video. See if you can work out what these sketch graphs look like for yourselves. And then in a few seconds, I'll move on to the next slide and show you what I think 2 of these graphs are likely to look like. So, one is continuous, which should be a scatter graph like the one drawn on the right hand side here for height. One is discontinuous, which should be a bar graph. That is eye colour shown on the left hand side. You'll notice how for height I've drawn a line of best fit in there, which roughly shows you how many of each type of people fit into each of these categories. Whereas for eye colour, it's a bar chart showing you 4 very distinct and very individual colours of eye. And both of these graphs show you that in a normal population of year 8 students, there is tremendous variation. None of you are the same, none of you look the same, none of you behave in the same way. You might share similarities. For example, according to my graph, 10 of my year 8s have brown eyes. But you don't necessarily all have exactly the same genetic makeup. Which is why, despite 10 people having brown eyes, there were a couple of people that had green eyes. And that shows you that there are differences between people. And the next couple of lessons, we're going to look at differences between plant height in seedlings. And I'm going to get you guys to have a look at some data and do some work with that as part of your required practical pieces. Stay safe and happy isolating.